Chris, you were trained in science. You are very much a believer in God. So from your perspective, what can religion learn from science? How should religion talk to science?
Well, I think theologians should take very seriously the developing picture that science offers us, not only of the huge sweep of cosmic history and of the long, intricate story of the evolutionary development of life on Earth, but also all sorts of aspects of how we come to be the creatures that we are. And science teaches us, for instance, that we are animals, very like in many ways a lot of other animals, and a lot of our responses and ways of behaving can be understood in those ways. I think, too, that we're starting to learn from science, interestingly, things about the origin and evolution of religious behavior, which will be enriching, I believe, for our overall picture of what it is to be a human being. So there are all sorts of things that the religious thinker can learn, although some caution is needed because science is fond of changing its mind, and therefore it is best not to invest too heavily in scientific theories until they've acquired a certain currency and robustness.
It would seem, though, perhaps, that talking to science from a theologian's point of view can be dangerous, because in theories of the universe or evolution, it could contradict at least what appear to be the literal understanding of scriptures of certain religions, on the one hand. And on the other, when we understand the biological basis for religious feelings in the brain, the different lobes, the temporal lobe, or the sociological development of religion in evolutionary psychology, it would seem to explain religion in very naturalistic terms, and in both cases, not leaving very much room for a supernatural reality behind religion.
Well, I think in all these sorts of cases, the question is whether the two sorts of explanation of phenomena, like of religious experience, for instance, whether the scientific and religious explanation can coexist with one another and mutually enrich one another, or whether in various cases one explanation will seek to displace another. And my experience working in this area over the last 20 years is that, generally speaking, those two sorts of explanation can mutually enrich one another and mutually inform one another. And that people who suppose that to explain something scientifically is to do away with the religious explanation are always, in my experience, oversimplifying the issue.
So to take the specific example of a religious feeling of experience and activity in the temporal lobe of the brain, are you saying that recognizing what may be a biological fact, this is maybe still early, but saying that maybe God intended that to be the mechanism that religious experience works?
Exactly, that I see no reason why one can't adopt a both-and account, recognizing that human experience is much about the brain, and therefore what we detect in the brain will be a description of how we're experiencing the world, but not ruling out the possibility that indeed God is using those processes to relate to human individuals.
And in the sociological development of religion, where you can show the needs of the group, the psychological patterns that relate to it, where you can explain the development of religion without any sort of supernatural causative effect. This again would be something built into the human psyche that God, in some primordial sense, enabled religion to flourish.
Yes, that's the sort of line that I would take, and over again, I would want to say to theologians, don't be afraid of these developing scientific pictures. Look at them carefully. Be wary of the descriptions that have an atheistic motivation, because they will have built in a rejection of religion. Mm-hmm. But look for the descriptions which actually would cohere with and sit in parallel with religious explanations.
And how do you defend against the claim that that's a non-falsifiable rationalization?
Theology has its own ways of testing the validity of its explanations. For instance, religious experience needs to be tested in community and against a tradition, rather than simply being taken on the basis of a single testimony. So theology and religious communities have their own rigorous ways of discerning what is of God and what is not, and I would expect those communities to use those practices of discernment just as science does.
You've taken one example of a very strong theological position in Christianity, the fall of human beings, as something that has been, if not disproved, certainly discredited by the fact of evolution. That's a very significant step you've taken. How do you defend that?
So much of theological thought, certainly in the Christian tradition, is to do with the continual reflection on and rereading of the scriptures and the tradition. And what I've done there, though it might seem radical, is simply to prefer one way of reading the ancient story of Genesis 3 over another. A rereading which sees that as an account of the way human life always tends to be, rather than an account on the basis of a single incident in the past. And that literal reading, I believe, doesn't hold in relation to science. Actually, science helps us a lot to see why it is that human beings are always proud, rebellious, violent, and potentially cruel creatures. So my rereading of Genesis 3, which I call Fallenness Without the Fall, I think is a rich and generative one, and actually in fruitful conversation with the way we understand human beings as evolved animals.